Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Vox Podcast. I'm your lovely host, Tim, and your not-so-lovely host, Mike. We are glad that you are here today. Thanks for tuning in. And we've got big news. Let me just say that. We're doing well, but we got big news. Team Erre has an edition that has made an impression on our family, but also on the internet. Team Erre got a puppy, which I swore I would never do in the history of. I remember telling my sweet wife, we can have kids or pets. You can pick. I'm good with either.
And then 17 years in.
17 years. We picked up Arlo. Arlo evidently is something called a cavapoo, which
is long for Ewok.
Yes. Oh my goodness. He's just a furry little Ewok, about the size of my shoe. And we got him for Hannah, and Hannah is just heads over heels, for Arlo. But Arlo is a 16-week-old puppy, and we're learning what that means. Yeah. And we've also learned something about our social media accounts this week, because I posted a picture of Arlo. And Tim, what did you say? What happened?
You posted the picture of Arlo the day after or the same day that we released this week's podcast episode, which we also post on social media, and Arlo destroyed the podcast episode. People were far more interested in the puppy than
which I think there's probably a lesson there.
Yeah.
So we're going to pivot the podcast more
towards
announcement. Puppy talk. Because I'm already learning some stuff. They have to take something called deworming, which
I remember.
I mean, that sounds horrific.
Yeah, but not as horrific as just worming.
and I'm not gonna lie, I tried some, just on the off chance, that maybe there's something going on in the digestive system that I didn't know about. But anyway,
so welcome to Puppy Pod. Our new podcast.
Yes. And the incredible, never-ending amount of ancillary products for your dog.
Yes.
I mean, the hemorrhaging. We're hemorrhaging cash flow.
We don't even have a dog, but when I go to Target and I see all the dog costumes, I'm always tempted to buy one. I don't know what it is.
Yeah. It's, as my children would say, totes adorbs.
Totes adorbs.
Yep,
That's highly sus.
I stand Arlo. That's all I'm going to say. And we did get, by the way, lots of corrections about where Stan comes from.
We did. It was,
and so that was very helpful. That was very, very helpful that we have some pop culture savants in the audience. Yes. Before we dive in today, I want to thank Sean and Deanne and Brandon and Claire for joining our Patreon team. And the podcast is free, making them is not. And we are very, very grateful that we have almost 200 people that support us at varying levels on Patreon. And then there is another platform we use called Tithely. Patreon is more if you're interested in some rewards or some tiered, repeated giving. Tithely, you can do repeated giving too, but it's also kind of better for one-time gifts. And everything you do is tax deductible because we are a 501c3. And I cannot tell you what an encouragement it is that so many of you have and are deciding to play a part. It's a big deal, and we're very, very grateful. Thanks to Noah, too, who increased. I feel like we're an NPR program right now. Thank you to Noah, who increased his pledge.
You have to bring the tone down, though, and get real close to the microphone.
Yeah,
welcome to Puppy Pod. Thank you, Noah, for
increasing your pledge. If you want to find out more, you can go to patreon.com, type in Vox Podcast with Mike Erre, and there you are. All of our levels are named after Pearl Jam songs, just in case you're wondering. Today, not shockingly, we're going to spend a little time in the Sermon on the Mount.
What?
Yep. What I want to do, Tim and our friend Kevin recommended this, that we would do a bit of review. Because this sucker, I mean, can you imagine trying to absorb this in one afternoon?
No.
And maybe he taught it over the course of several days, but still, it's absolutely crazy. And so, just as a reminder, what Jesus starts doing in Matthew chapter 4 is he begins to preach that the kingdom of God has come close. It's near now. And for the Jews of the day, the kingdom of God was a political reality. It was not going to heaven when you die. It was not a nice set of doctrinal beliefs or a cute set of moral convictions. This was the story that was left hanging in the Old Testament. When will God become king over his people Israel and over his world? When Jesus shows up and announces the kingdom and proclaims that both in his teaching and in his ministry he will embody the kingdom, that was a hugely divisive message. And not surprisingly, the religious leaders were the most threatened by it. The political rulers towards the end of Jesus' ministry were the most threatened by it. But to the common folk, to the folks identified at the beginning of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus gazes upon, the demon-possessed and the sick and the tradespeople and the underprivileged, and he announces that his kingdom is made up of such as these, the merciful and the poor in spirit and the mourning and the peacemakers is what I was looking for. So that he then says that community in its weakness becomes salt and light. It's not an advance guard of triumphalism. It's not an advance guard of awesomeness. It is in its weakness, God is made great, and so in such people, the kingdom is trustworthy, because we realize that, and because we realize, the last thing when you get the poor in spirit together, they're going to want to do is run the world, right? They're just not. No one's going to sign up for that on the poor in spirit, anonymous website. That's just not how it's going to work. And so what Jesus begins to do is he begins to unfold the reality of the political entity called the kingdom of God. Now, the reason the kingdom of God is political is that classically defined, politics has to do with the administration of a polis, and a polis is simply a community of people gathered together. So, and you could say it this way, politics is just the art of helping people get along together. That's all it is. How do we handle wealth? How do we handle marriage? How do we handle sickness? How do we handle tribal violations? All of that. And so there are, the church is political in that sense. The family, the unit, is political in that sense. Yeah. But very, very specifically, the message of Jesus is political. That Jesus, as he begins to outline what his agenda is, it's not to form a people who are very, very concerned about what happens when we die, but it was those people who were ready to welcome the reign of heaven into their midst to the point where they would rearrange their social relationships to be a part of it. And so Jesus begins by rearranging social relationships, where the light commands would say, hey, anger, yeah, don't hate your fellow Israelite, yes, but that's not as heavy as the command to not murder. And Jesus is like, whoa. How it works in my kingdom, I've not come to abolish the law of the prophets, but to fulfill them. And in fact, I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, by any means disappear from the law. So Jesus is outlining his kingdom as a fully Orthodox Jewish rabbi would. He's there showing and deepening and extending Torah. All right? Then he says, and he gets into the I tell you, if anyone who sets aside the least of these commands and teaches others will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And here, as we've said, he's talking about light and heavy commands. There were 613. They were not all equally weighted. Obviously, they would come into conflict. And so if working on the Sabbath, not working on the Sabbath conflicted with saving a life, which one wins? I mean, so the rabbis did the hard work of ordering and debating how these all fit together. But there was, in the midst of that, a getting around the heart of the Torah, the heart of the righteousness of the kingdom, by playing the, well, at least I'm not doing X game while you were doing Y, right? And so Jesus goes after, and Jesus is embodying this greater righteousness he's calling for by saying, listen, it's not just murder that we're talking about, it's anger and contempt. That is what the kingdom is interested in. It's not just, you've not fulfilled the law to your neighbor by loving your neighbor by simply not murdering them. That doesn't, you've not fulfilled that command by simply letting them live, right?
Look at me, folks. Look at me go.
Yeah.
Do you see my neighbors dead?
I haven't murdered anybody yet, so I'm doing great. And certainly we would agree that's a good start. But that was not the mighty righteousness of which the Old Testament prophets spoke.
Not to downplay not murdering your neighbors.
Yes, let's keep that going. But let's also deal with this deeper issue, right? And so he does that with anger and contempt, right? The light and the heavy commands. He's like, listen, that distinction just doesn't hold when you look at the mighty righteousness of God's law, right? Because where does murder start? Murder starts in the heart. He redefines adultery away from it being one-sided and tilted against women to now it being an issue of the heart as well, right? That adultery now, what had to do was tied in the light and heavy sense to, now it was tied to the heavy command of against coveting. Yeah. And that whereas before, the rules of adultery were very much stacked against women, that Jewish men had permissions Jewish women did not have. Now, Jesus gives us such a high ethic in order to say that the kingdom is now safe for women, to not be sexualized, to not be objectified, even if the men are not physically committing adultery. Again, it's that same game. Hey, I'm loving my neighbor, I haven't committed adultery, right? Oh, well, that's a great start, but let's work on where that comes from. He then connects adultery to a Jewish debate on divorce. And he redefines adultery in a way that protects Jewish women. And this, he says, was always the heart of God, right? So that divorce thing, I think that's super important. And it's one of the best examples of Jesus entering into a Jewish debate. And us, when we neglect that background, just ripping that verse straight out of the text and applying it, we can do a great deal of damage with it, right? Jesus is very much proclaiming the righteousness, because remember, he says, your righteousness must surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And so what he's going to do in the rest of chapter 5, what we've been studying for several weeks, has been to show how the kingdom righteousness is deeper and wider and truer and more beautiful than the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. Right? And he's doing that using this light and heavy distinction. So here he steps into this debate about divorce. He steps into the debate around oath making and truth telling, right? And how far, if you didn't use God's name, could you swear an oath? And he's like, no, in my kingdom, righteousness simply demands that we not manipulate each other with religious language.
Yeah.
It's not about, the oath taking is not about swearing or profanity as we would understand it. It's about attaching the name of God in order to manipulate other people, right? Hello, relevance. And then Jesus goes after the preeminent law governing all social affairs then and now, and that is the law of reciprocity, right? I do to you whatever you've done to me. And he goes after it negatively by saying, listen, under the law, retaliation was limited to injury for injury. But I'm telling you, that was not the heart of God. The heart of God is that you wouldn't retaliate at all. And instead of not doing nothing, that you would respond in creative ways to protect your honor and call into question the honor of your persecutor.
Yeah.
Right? And so the turning of the cheeks and the offering of the cloak, all of those were just very, very creative ways of dealing with evil.
Yeah.
And then he deals with the positive part, right? Because the negative part of reciprocity is I get to harm those who harm me. The positive part of reciprocity is, well, I get to love those who love me. And Jesus is now going to say, and it's framed around who my neighbor is, right? That was the Jewish debate around neighbor. Who's my neighbor? Is a Samaritan my neighbor? Is a Roman soldier my neighbor? Is an unclean Israelite my neighbor? And Jesus expands neighbor to include every single person on the planet, right? Not just your fellow country people.
Not your peeps.
Yep, not just your peeps. And what you're to do to those who you would consider enemies is you were to show them agape, right? Which is self-suffering, self-sacrificial love. And he describes, he ultimately says, and this is the perfection that is demonstrated by the Father that you're invited into, that the rain is showered on the just and the unjust. And that even tax collectors love those who love them. There's nothing special about that. You are to be like your Father, not like the tax collectors. That's the idea. So that whole section is flowing out of chapter 5, verse 20, which is your righteousness must surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees. So he's presenting a positive view of righteousness, but he's also undercutting the way the scribes and Pharisees interpreted Torah.
Yeah.
Now, when you get to chapter 6, we're just going to read the first verse together. And the guest reader today is me, the voice of an angel. All right? Let me find it. Where is it? I don't know. Oh, yes. Yes. Chapter 6, verse 1. Be careful not to practice your what, Timothy?
Righteousness.
Yeah, now where did that word come from? How about chapter 5, verse 20? Your righteousness must surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees. So he's just given us the rest of the chapter on one critique of the Pharisees and their understanding of righteousness. Now he's introducing critique number 2. All right? Critique number 2 is be careful to not practice your righteousness in front of others in order to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward in heaven. Now, when we talked about righteousness before, several episodes ago, righteousness in the Old Testament was this incredibly huge concept. Zedekah.
That's right.
And it included loving kindness and justice and mercy. But it had been reduced a bit by the Pharisees to 3 acts of piety, and the most important one was almsgiving. So there were 3 acts of piety that constituted for the Pharisees righteousness, right? That was prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Almsgiving is giving to the poor. And what Jesus is now going to do is he's going to lay down, be careful, do not practice your righteousness in front of people in order to be seen by them. And then he's going to give 3 examples. And those 3 examples are almsgiving, prayer, and fasting. And it's awesome. I mean, it's just so, you could not have missed how Jesus was undercutting the Pharisaic program.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder these were some of his most vociferous opponents, right?
Yeah.
He's not, because he told us in chapter 5, let people see your good deeds, that they may give glory to the Father in heaven.
Yeah.
Now he's saying, but if you do your good deeds in order to be seen by people and for that reason only, then you have your reward. Their approval is your reward. If all you're doing is this to be seen, and my goodness, we're going to spend in a couple of episodes a whole episode on grandstanding, because this In our image social media age, this is all we do, right? Does it count as justice unless I've taken a picture? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, it's this Jesus here goes after a virtue signaling and making, just having to be seen to have the right opinion, even if I don't really have it.
Yeah. Hashtag culture.
Yes, he is. It's devastating to all of us. But for those of us who are more sort of classically religious, we were taught you have a quiet time, you go to church, you share your faith, you give 10%. And so we were given lists of piety too.
Yeah.
And it was important in some instances that you be seen being pious. And so this isn't just for hashtag culture, this is for church culture too. But it began with Pharisee culture. And so Jesus is going to go after the hypocrisy of the Pharisees and simply say, if it's the approval of people you're looking for, then the approval of people you shall get, but you have missed the Father in the process.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into some really good stuff, because in the midst of this, he gives us the Lord's Prayer. And he critiques the praying of the hypocrites and gives us this prayer to pray. So we're going to spend some time on that too. So, that's what he's up to. So for 20 or so verses of chapter 6, he's going to go after prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and then he's going to talk about money. Now, this is still an extension of the deeper righteousness, but he's going to connect it to worry, which, oh my Lord, there it is. So he's not letting up on us. I would say we have at least 8 or 10 podcasts more to go on this. And remember, our whole slant on this was to talk about the political implications.
Yeah.
Right? We're not interested in the partisan implications, right? Because partisanship has to do with how you vote. The politics of the kingdom has to do with how you live. Yeah. Now, that includes how you vote one moment every 4 years, but it's so much bigger than just how you vote.
Yeah.
And that's the vision we're trying to recapture, right? The ordering of God's people as they are together under the reign of Jesus. That's political.
Yeah.
And how the church, how that collection of people then interacts with the greater polis, that's political. But our emphasis when we talk about politics is just on Republican or Democrat or neither. And because of that, we miss the Father in the process, right? Because the kingdom cannot be equated with a nation state or with a particular political agenda. It's just the mighty Zedekiah of God cannot be captured by any platform of human political persuasion.
We're going to have to make that on a t-shirt.
Now, before we dive in to this next section of the sermon, we thought there was a question that came in that we wanted to talk about and kind of use to get into some other news besides Arlo that we want to talk about today. So, ladies and gentlemen, Tim Stafford, questions come to us through our email, hello@voxpodcast. Facebook, you can like us on Facebook. We're on Twitter and Instagram. And we try to keep track. There's so many things that come in. I have a long list of things that several years old of different topics. So we'll never run out of material. But sometimes every now and again something will hit and it's really relevant. And so anyway, this has to do with the church. And as we hear all of this Jesus talk and talk of the kingdom, a very natural question that arises is, okay, well, what's this mean for church?
Yeah.
Right? Because this doesn't always reflect the priorities and values of the church. So, Timothy, take it away.
All right, here's our question. It caught my attention in this episode, or maybe the previous one. I went back and listened to that one again also, that Tim, said he was just angry with the current state of affairs with the church. I am struggling with bitterness and anger at the unreconciled beliefs I have held and currently question, and the current stands my pastor is taking from the pulpit. I have asked many people what they feel the reason is for church and the definition of a shepherd and what that role looks like. I'm confused, angry, and hurt. My husband and I have leadership titles in the church we attend, but are finding the church to be solely owned and operated by the pastor. In all of this ranting, my questions to you are just those. What is the reason for church, and what is the role of the shepherd? I know where bitterness and anger lead. I know I have to gain back some balance. Help, please.
Wow. So first of all, what a wonderful question. Thank you for your honesty. And I think Tim and I would both agree that many people feel the same way.
Yeah.
And so you are not alone in this. In fact, we got another question I think I saw it today, that was along these same lines, asking advice for where do we find, a good church. And so could you read just the last, what is church and what is the role of a shepherd, correct? Those are the two questions.
Yeah, what is the reason for church and what is the role of the shepherd?
Fantastic. All right. This is really, really good. So God created the world, and the scene, particularly in Genesis 2, is of a king placing images of the king into its temple. Genesis 2, particularly, Genesis 1 is the creation of the world, actually the creation of the promised land through a Sabbath cycle. And that's something we've talked about in previous episodes. Yeah. Genesis 2 is the enthronement of a king in a garden temple, in an ancient Near Eastern garden temple. And what a king would do is place images of the king's self all over the garden that would be stand-ins for its authority and representation, viceroys, if you will. Whose job it was, if they were just statues, to reflect the likeness of the king. But if they were priests, it was to advance the agenda of the king. And we get both imagery in Genesis 2. Priestly imagery is all over the place. And so when the humans are created and they're to bear the image of God, and the first commands they receive are to fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish and the birds. And so they're given a royal vocation under the reign of their king. And their job was to make more image bearers and to extend, because Eden, this garden, didn't cover the whole world. This was just a part of it. Because we soon read in Genesis that there are other people in other places. So this is, and there are some scholars, and I have firmly believed this, that Eden was the promised land initially. And when the man and the woman are exiled from the promised land, it's several chapters later until Abram gets called to go back. Not in its Edenic state, but rather to reconstitute what God had originally intended, which was a humanity that lived under his governance, promoting the flourishing of other humans and creation, right? So they were given a vocation to do this. Now, our first mother and father, however you understand this, rejected that vocation, created a counter kingdom that was the same as the rest of the kingdoms around them. There was nothing distinct about it. God, in grief, uncreates the world by allowing the waters to overflow, at least that portion of the globe. And carries forward one family, Noah and his sons and their wives. From that family, we meet a man named Abram in Genesis chapter 12. Now, God's first attempt at this has not gone well, right? He wanted to create cooperative participants in governance and co-governance over the world. And what has happened instead is those co-governors usurped the rule that was rightly theirs and gave it to bits of creation itself, so that everything was now turned upside down. God then calls, in response to this evil, God then calls a man, Abram, in Genesis chapter 12. And this man he calls to be a nation, an ethnic people, through whom a blessing for the nations will come. And as the Old Testament unfolds, we read about how God kept his promise first to this old and fertile couple, then through various ridiculous circumstances, that God always kept his word. We get more and more insight into where this promised blessing is going to come from, right? At the end of Genesis, it's through the tribe of Judah. In Samuel, it's from the line of David. Israel gets formed into an ethnic nation with geopolitical boundaries. And they're given the Torah in order to demonstrate to the world the goodness of living under God's rule, right? The man and the woman were to live under God's rule for the sake of the nations. Israel was created to live under God's rule for the sake of the nations as well. As we know, they were about as successful as Adam and Eve, right? Over the long course of generations, they reject God as their king. They end up generations later in exile, scattered throughout the nations, right? Cast out, again, exiled, if you will, just like Adam and Eve were from the land.
Yeah.
Oh, and the mighty cry of the prophets and the poets during that time was that there will come a time when God will take his world back. He will come, he will install Israel at the head of the nations, and he will now bring about the kingship that was rejected by Adam and Eve and rejected by Israel. He will do this in a different way. He will do this through his Spirit. And so Jesus Messiah shows up, and the first thing he says is the kingdom of God has come. The second thing he does is he begins to gather a community. So notice, in all three steps, kingdom has to do with a king forming a people. So Genesis 1 and 2, God creates human beings. In Genesis 12, God calls a man to form a community. And then it's not shocking when Jesus shows up, right? The first thing he does in announcing the kingdom is he gathers a tribe around him, all right? Yeah. The goal was always a collection of people called out of human history in the kingdoms of the world who would live under the reign of Yahweh and his son Yahshua, demonstrating to the world the blessings that were God's in order to woo the nations back to himself. So, what's the church? The church is just that pattern repeated now for us. Yeah. The church, according to Paul, it's the confounding wisdom of God against the powers and principalities because it consists of people who have no ethnic tie together, unlike Israel, or economic tie together, like the upper crust of Roman society, or moral tie together, but rather consist of a people baptized into a new creation humanity where all of the other ways of distinguishing and dividing people are now rendered obsolete, and that in Christ is the only designation that matters. And that these people were to constitute a political entity, the kingdom, in local communities called the church, that would be local expressions of the ultimate triumph and work of God through his Son, accomplished by the Spirit in willing partnership with human persons. So that the church isn't a service, it's not a singing teaching event. The church is the identity of the people. You can no more follow Christ and not be part of a church than you could be born and not have parents, right? You are by definition, as a Christian, a part of church.
Yeah.
Now, the confusion comes when we mistake the local gathering of the church for the kingdom. The kingdom is not contained by the church. The church very, very often feels more like a political party. It's got its own agenda. It exists for its own self-preservation. It often is a platform for celebrity leaders. And so there's much to be disappointed in how the church bears witness to the kingdom. And that's done very poorly, and your frustration is warranted. But there are people and there are places that bear witness to the kingdom rightly, or at least more faithfully. No one does it perfectly, only Jesus does that. So when we're talking about a church, we're talking about finding a community of people who, at least in varying degrees, have all agreed to submit themselves to the reign of Christ as it pertains to the reordering of their real lives. And at that point, realize that they can only work that out in community with each other. And so that can look in a thousand different institutional and organizational ways. Right? The idea of an event Sunday that's sermon-centric and one person, and that's not a biblical idea. That's an American idea that, God can use because he can use everything. But, I don't know if you draw it up and that's the place Jesus would start if he was founding a church. It just didn't look a lot like ours. So, on the one hand, and this is straight from Tim Gambas, on the one hand, we have to have the ability to critically think. Mm-hmm. We have to, and because I'm not being a jerk. I'm critical of my tribe because for the same reason I'm critical of me, right? I have hope for it.
Yes.
I want it to be better. And so, yes, we've talked about the dangers of sermon-centric church, and we've talked about the dangers of churches that rely on who pay people vocationally instead of relying on bivocational pastors. And that doesn't, right? All of that's true. All of that's true. But we don't engage in those conversations. We want to do that having a critical heart. Excuse me, I totally messed up the punchline. We want to have a critical mind without having a critical heart. That's the idea. That's from Gambas. And so, what is the church? The church is the most important social entity in the world. That's just now how well that gets embodied is so variable. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But does it matter? And is your disappointment warranted? Yes and yes. For sure. What's a shepherd? Well, somebody who takes the Sermon on the Mount seriously.
Yeah.
And invites people to do the same. Now, shepherds don't necessarily have to be pastors, nor pastor shepherds. Right? That's a metaphor and a picture that very clearly had nuance in those cultures that we miss today. Shepherding wasn't just be nice. You led, you protected, there was stuff attached to that. But when I look at the health of a church, I'm looking at, does it prioritize and bear witness to the kingdom? In other words, does it see itself as a means to some other end than its own self-preservation? Because and every church will say, oh yeah, we just want to point to Christ. But they don't spend money like that, and they don't live like that, and they don't talk like that. Anybody who says it's all about Jesus, who has to say that, means they're not all about Jesus. You know what I mean? If you have to announce that at your events, then I'm sorry, you're in trouble. Right? Because the best stuff that's all about Jesus is stuff you'll hardly ever notice.
Yeah.
It's so behind the radar. It's so mustard seed. It's like yeast that just infects slowly through the whole batch of dough, right? The smallest seed that slowly grows into a shrub. It covers the whole backyard. So I don't know if I'm answering the question. I'm just riffing on why I think the church is so incredibly important. And I want to riff on the fact that on the one hand, we want to be wide awake to the abuses of power. So just things off the top of my head. What's the church's view on women? If they treat women well, Does the church show weakness, or does everything have to be beautiful, skinny jeaned, and perfect? Are the leaders collaborative, or is it just one person? When you talk about, you have titles, but it's Senior Pastor Inc. Well, flee. That's not. I've done that. I'm guilty of that, and that is not the New Testament model at all. What are you thinking, Tim? You're giving me lots of different facial expressions.
No, I'm running with it. I wrote down words as you were going. Even from the beginning of all this, you were talking when you were summing up the this whole first section of the Sermon on the Mount. You talked about the people being seen as trustworthy, and I think that that's a really profound idea, because so much of what Jesus just walked through was living and operating through a way in which you don't preach trustworthiness. You exude it through just like this very active living in this stuff. So, and then the own and operated. I'm the church thing has been a very conflicting thing for a while. And Gombas he has a podcast episode that I think we've talked about. I can't remember if it was on here. It may have been on here if it was on his own podcast. About like being a lifer in a church. Like,
right. That's
when
on
you're
his.
in there, you're in there, and you're putting 20, 30 years in with people. And so that's where my real struggle has been lately, because I am so turned off by Christian rhetoric and Christian routine. So just the whole performance, and I see this so much in the Sermon on the Mount, where it's just like, it's not, you've heard it said, and I feel like he's almost saying like, you've heard it done, or you've seen it done this way. And I'm saying, no, this is how you should be doing it, or embodying this, or living this. And I don't feel like I always see that. And then so my inclination is often to just stop.
Yes.
Like, I'm turned off. I don't want to be a part of this anymore.
Yeah.
And then you hear Gombas, which is very conflicting not convicting.
Well, both.
It's also conflicting. Of like, you got to be in there, and you're living that. And if, it's just.
But why? But why? See, the point is that you can only be shaped in a cross Jesus-y kind of way in a community like that.
Yeah.
Where
how long do you buckle in there to help that community become that community?
Well, how long do you invest in yourself for that?
Forever?
I mean, I'm not saying I'm just saying, okay, what am I saying? First, in this season of my life, seeing so clearly how many shortcomings, how many character faults, like, and the more work I do, the more work I see I have to do, the more I just sit and I go, I'm way less, I don't know, I'm way less critical of other people who aren't where I'm at yet. And then we'll get to that in the sermon, right? I mean,
right.
The hardest part is to love people you think are behind you. And so, so many learnings there. I'm not saying you hang in always. No, not at all. There are clear instances in the Bible and just, scattered all over America where you should leave. But it's kind of like the divorce conversation, right? Just because there's permission to leave doesn't alleviate the importance of the thing.
Right.
And I am very much someone who needs to walk in repentance towards my attitudes towards the church. I've been deeply hurt in some instances. I've deeply hurt others in other instances. And I just want to shake my hands and the dust off my feet at all of it.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. I just don't think we can. And that's why we still agitate on this dumb podcast,
Well, I think we're also, there's a big question as to why millennials or what's behind millennials, Gen Z.
Let's see, millennials, Gen Z, and then it's something else. I don't remember. But anyway, go ahead.
There's always a big question as to why they're not going to church. Why are we not attracting this demographic? Why do these people? And I think it's really interesting because I've had conversations with a few people now about that, and often the consistent theme has been, we are not interested in the performance. Yep. Like, we go to Coachella, we go to whatever, we see the best version of lights and performance and that feeling. We want authenticity. We want to be a part of something that is transparent. And so you keep hearing that, and it's like a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, the current church model is still based on this routine and this performance. And you see this younger generation coming up that's like, we're not interested in that.
Yeah.
And they're also not big, like, I'm going to give you tons and tons of money for the church to operate. They're not as big of investors, so that's going to change the model as well. So it's a really interesting, I feel like the tides are shifting and that there is a big movement coming that is not a movement, but there is a change coming. Whether the church is ready for that or not,
yes,
is a different conversation.
Yep. Which leads me into a bit of personal news.
Yes.
This was not all mystically set up, by the way. But I think it's a really good conversation because I think this might strike some people as a little jarring. A bit of backstory. Moved to Ohio over 3 years ago. And I did it for some reasons that I thought were true and compelling. And I've since learned that I did it for other reasons. And that's a whole different story. It has been a very deconstructing and dismantling kind of process in so many ways. And it's been the roughest for my wife and I, just the roughest 3 years together, not just with each other, but just in life. And by global standards, we're doing great. But just in terms of like character work and things that were exposed, oh my goodness. Many of you are familiar with the story of last fall or late last fall and through the year. And I'm not going to tell that again. It's in other episodes. But I have been doing a great deal of personal work with Jesus, in therapy, with a spiritual director, with friends, family. The biblical word for all of this work is just repentance. It's not a bad word. It's just it's a turning. It's a reconsidering. And the grace that comes is the grace that I've been able to see things that have been true of me for a long time that I've never been able to see. And as I begin to unnumb and begin to heal, I began to pray and talk with these friends and advisors. What's the healthiest way of living for me? And we all agreed working from home as a full-time podcaster is not the healthiest way for me to be living. I'm too social of a creature, and it just opens the door for things that just don't need to be open. And so we began to pray about, okay, well, what's a job going to look like? Is it, I applied to the post office, city government, as a maintenance worker. I applied to just some other churches just to have income, and all of those I got turned down for. But John Mark Comer, who is a friend of our show, pastor in Portland, he had this line one day that opened up a way of thinking that I wasn't I wasn't really considering. And I don't know who he's quoting, but he's like, retreating away from your wounding will never heal it. You always have to, healing means moving back toward the thing that broke us with new people in a new way. And we really sat in that for a long time. And from that came the beginnings of what I thought was an insane desire to work for a church again. And in spite of all that I believe about it, in spite of all the criticisms that I believe about it, I still have hope. And I don't want to just sit on the sideline and pontificate into a microphone in my house without a greater degree of investment and hard work. But there were several issues that immediately, raised. One was, dude, you're just dealing with some of the heaviest stuff ever. Pretty massive character failures and flaws. And do you really need a platform? And should you have one? Secondly, what kind of church would you even, does the kind of church I would want to be a part of exist? And then the third one is, would that kind of church be interested in someone like me, who's at the very beginning of a healing journey?
Right.
And so those are fairly significant things. And where all of this is going, well, one more step. So we thought, okay, and this is, again, combination of therapy, friends, advisors, spiritual director. If we were to ever work for a church, here's what kind of church it would have to be. And here's what kind of role it would have to be. Not a senior pastor role, not an elder role, not a public leader role. We didn't want it to be a humongous megachurch. I think that would be too triggering in some ways. We wanted it to be a church that was very much open to therapy and mental health issues. And we wanted it to be a church that had a high view of women and women in leadership, and gave a great deal of permission for people to doubt and wonder and question and be in process.
Be human.
Yes. So that's all of that wrapped up is a fairly narrow thing.
Yeah.
And so I didn't tell anybody of this. I literally just prayed. And I said, okay, Lord, if that's a thing, okay. If not, I'll be glad to work for UPS. I get to wear shorts all year. We're fine. I look great in brown. And a couple weeks after that, I get a call from a friend who I worked with in Meritor's church, a church in Nashville that meets. I would never have known of this, and out of the blue, was looking for a teaching pastor who was not going to be a senior pastor or an elder. A church that isn't humongous, a church that has a high view of women and meets all the criteria, and a church that was willing to know my story and all of its ugliness and still want to be a community where my family and I can work towards health. And I never thought I'd say this again, but I've accepted a job at a church. And we're going to do the podcast. The church is super supportive of the podcast. Like, they think it's a necessary thing, which is amazing and gracious of them, Yeah. But what a unique and compelling group of people this has turned out to be.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're willing to know the story and to say, yep, well, let's put all of this in place and then let's walk together,
Yeah.
Oh, and I just get to be a teacher, which is what I love to do,
Yes.
So the podcast is still going to be going strong. Nothing's going to change with that. Not a thing's going to change with that. We still see that as a super important, vibrant part of human life.
Yeah.
My family, I'm going to commute to Nashville 3 or 4 times a month. 6-hour drive, which is not bad at all. And then if we're still all good, we'll move down at the end of the school year after Nate, my oldest son, graduates from high school. I feel weird saying all of this. I don't know why. It just does. I never thought I'd talk like this. I never thought I'd do this again. I really had given it up. And, and it was, and, and as I'm talking to my therapist, I mean, I know not everyone cares, but my therapist was like, look, until the trauma piece has been healed, any job can be a place where you perform and hide.
Yeah. Right.
So it was like, even if you think going to UPS is going to solve all your problems, that's not true. That's not true. And they kept saying she kept saying the danger of a different job would be that I wouldn't have the same crew around me. I wouldn't have people who knew or cared about this part of life. And, it's like, where do you practice humility? Is it the false humility of, well, I just have to, it was just all this humongous and deep stuff, and I wouldn't try to justify it for people. But this has been the most deliberate, thoughtful, prayerful decision-making process I've ever been a part of. The healthiest, you, Bonnie, Kevin, Joanna, which is our Vox team, John Mark, who's spiritual director, Tina, who's my therapist, my family. This is all like, so I'm taking my talents to Nashville. That's what I'm doing, to quote LeBron.
Taking my talents in Nashville.
Yep. So anyway, we didn't know how best to say that, but that's what we thought. Tim, do you have any comments, or from your perspective, as you've observed all of this, what do you think?
No, I think you summed it up really good. I see it's easy for me to trust the process, having watched it and knowing that this isn't necessarily what you wanted to do. And in some ways you were scared of ever doing this again. So I think that the fact that the road kind of led back to this in the way that it did feels trustworthy. It also feels really trustworthy. I don't remember what episode it was talking about. Was it Jacob? Don't ever trust anyone that doesn't walk with a limp.
Yes.
And I see that in this process too, where, and maybe that's part of the things that I'm struggling with church and the performative nature of it, is that the openness of the just the blemishes and the struggle and that kind of stuff doesn't seem to necessarily always be a part of church.
No.
And it's such a part of everything that Jesus is doing in everything. So it's like, I don't know, if this feels healthy and it feels good and it feels right, it feels like you turned around and repostured yourself, and then God said, that's what I wanted, and then came alongside of it.
I don't know. I hope so. I've done some reckless crap, and so I fear, being judged that way again. But I would certainly deserve that. But this isn't. It feels a lot. I don't know.
It feels different.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you think so. Your opinion, and this whole team thing has been really. Brenda has been a part of this.
Yes.
Our friend Brenda.
Big
so
time.
yes, it's been a big deal. But yeah, I'm not going to talk a lot about it. We're still going to do the Vox thing, and so for me, that whole like having a critical mind without a critical spirit, this is where I want to practice.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because
it's important too to tell everybody here, because everybody that listens to this podcast we intentionally walked this road publicly, and openly and honestly. So
yes,
we're not here just telling our news because we think you'd be interested in every decision that we make in our lives.
We got Arlo; they're interested in that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was interesting. So I wrote a long mushy email to my friends, these people I've named, as I was driving down to Nashville to interview, because Nashville's where I went in January I went on a 6.5 day, I don't know, the group therapy thing. That was the most intense thing I've ever been a part of. And I remember driving down to Tennessee and thinking, and just being so fearful and anxious. And then I remember thinking, driving down again, going, being fearful and anxious, but being grateful for the opportunity that a group of people who would know, and we've been ruthlessly honest, would know all of that, and still, that Nashville became this place like of healing and restoration, and I don't know. So anyway, it feels like a big deal to us.
Yeah.
And I think it represents a commitment. We started with Vox. I mean, it's the reason we started a church out of Vox to begin with. We want to be a part of the solution while admitting that we're part of the problem.
Yeah.
You know? So anyhow, there you have it, sports fans. That's a lot, man. That is a lot to cover in an episode. Dang. So blessings to you all, friends. Seriously, thank you. Tim, any last words?
Nope.
Next episode, we've got a great interview. Yeah. And then we'll pick up the Sermon on the Mount after that. So until next time, friends, thank you for listening. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this conversation. The Vox Podcast is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that is supported by listeners like yourself. If you'd like to partner with us, you can do so at patreon.com/Vox Podcast. You can also engage with the hosts on social media at facebook.com/Vox Podcast, on Instagram at Vox Podcast, and on Twitter at Mike Erie. Thank you for walking this road with us.